Fidel Castro, the leader of revolutionary Cuba, died on the 26th of November 2016 at the age of 90. In a long and rich life, he had transformed his own island and, in fact, the rest of South America. In times to come, historians will estimate his real impact on his own continent and the rest of the world. When did it all start? On the 26th of July, 1953, Fidel Castro, then an angry young lawyer, led a small band of armed men in an attempt to seize the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba in Oriente province. Most of the guerrillas were killed. Castro was tried and defended himself with a masterly speech, replete with classical references and quotations from Balzac and Rousseau, that ended with the words, "Condemn me, it does not matter, history will absolve me." This won him both notoriety and popularity. Released in an amnesty in 1954, Fidel Castro left the island and began to organize a rebellion in Mexico. For a time, he stayed in the hacienda that had once belonged to the legendary Mexican revolutionary Emiliano Zapata. In 1956, 82 people, including Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, set sail from Mexico in a tiny vessel called Granma and headed for the impenetrable forested hills of the Sierra Maestra in Oriente province. Ambushed by soldiers belonging to the Batista dictatorship after they had landed, 12 survivors reached the Sierra Maestra and began the guerrilla war. They were backed by a strong urban network of students, workers, public employees, many others who became the backbone of the 26th of July movement. And the movement grew from strength to strength. News of their exploits spread throughout the island and in the big neighbor towards the north. The New York Times got interested, dispatching its legendary correspondent Herbert Matthews to see who these guys with beards and guns were like. By 1958, the guerrilla armies of Fidel Castro and Che Guevara and Camilo Cienfuegos and Raul Castro and many others began to move from the mountains to the plains. A column led by Fidel began to take towns in Oriente, while Che Guevara's irregulars stormed and took the central Cuban city of Santa Clara. The day after, Batista and his mafia chums fled the island as the rebel army, now greeted as liberators, marched across the island into Havana. This scene has been graphically captured in the Godfather movies, where the hold of the mafia on the island, on Cuba, has been graphically portrayed, much better portrayed, incidentally, than the bleatings of the liberal critics of Fidel Castro who have been in full cry this week, liberals of all sorts, no understanding of the revolution whatsoever, except that it has to be attacked. The popularity of the revolution was there for all to see. Castro's victory stunned the Americas. It soon became obvious that this was no ordinary event. Any doubts as to the revolution's intentions were dispelled by the first declaration of Havana. This was Fidel Castro's declaration of total independence from the United States, made in public before 1 million people in Revolution Square. Why did he do this? Because the reaction in the United States was extremely nervous. They didn't know who these guys were. They didn't know what they were going to do. They wondered whether Castro would go beyond the agreed confines of South American upheavals and do something that was unacceptable to Washington. Even as Washington was wondering where Fidel was going to go, it soon became clear, and the North Americans reacted angrily and hastily, trying to cordon off the new regime from the rest of the continent. This was their biggest fear. Would the Cuban Revolution spread to other parts of South America? For if it did, that would be the end of American hegemony in a continent that they had dominated and ruled ever since the Monroe Doctrine was declared. American concerns did not bother the Cubans too much. The response of the Cuban leadership was ultra-radical. It decided to nationalize all American-owned industries without compensation. 3 months later, on the 13th of October, 1961, the United States severed diplomatic relations. Subsequently, it armed Cuban exiles in Florida and launched an invasion of the island near the Bay of Pigs. It was defeated. President Kennedy, for it was he, the great liberal president of the United States, who launched the Bay of Pigs invasion, then imposed a total economic blockade, pushing the Cubans in Moscow's direction. And the bleating liberals in their newspapers who talk today about why the Cubans had to limit democracy and declare revolutionary dictatorship have to look at themselves, have to look at what the United States did, have to see that in the conditions created of invasion and blockade and attempts on the life of Fidel Castro and others, democracy was the one thing that became impossible in Cuba. In February 1962, the Second Declaration of Havana denounced the US presence in South America and called for the liberation of the entire continent. 40 years later, Fidel explained the necessity for the declaration. At the beginning of the revolution, he said, we made 2 statements, which we called the First and Second Declarations of Havana. That was during a rally of over millions of people in Revolution Square. Through these declarations, we were responding to the plans being hatched in the United States against Cuba and against Latin America. The United States forced every Latin American country to break off relations with Cuba. These declarations said that an armed struggle should not be embarked on if there existed legal and constitutional conditions for a peaceful civic struggle. That was our thesis in relation to Latin America. While they were in the Sierra Maestra, the direction that the revolution would take was still not clear, even to Fidel Castro. Until that point, he had never been a socialist, and relations with the official Cuban Communist Party were often tense. It was the reaction of the noisy and powerful neighbor from the north that helped determine the orientation of the revolution. The results were mixed, though largely positive. Politically, the dependence on the Soviet Union led to the mimicking of Soviet institutions and all that that entailed. Socially, the Cuban Revolution created an incredible dynamic. It produced an education system, a health service, a degree of public housing that remain the envy, even today, of much of the neoliberal world. Cuban internationalism was not confined to South America. When the apartheid South African state intervened in Angola to try and crush the liberation movement, the MPLA, and establish a puppet government together with its collaborators UNITA, the Cuban leaders were outraged. They decided to help the MPLA against the apartheid army, regardless of what the Soviet Union thought or did not think. In a speech explaining the decision to the Cuban people, Fidel Castro reminded them that most of the slaves that had been brutally uprooted and brought to Cuba were from Angola and neighboring regions. We shall now repay that debt to our African friends and comrades. The result was a military defeat of the South African army in Angola, an event that struck a heavy blow against the white dictatorship in Pretoria. It marked the beginning of the end of apartheid, and soon after his release, Nelson Mandela flew to Havana to thank Fidel and the Cuban Revolution and the Cuban people for their sacrifices in Africa. We haven't always agreed with Comrade Constantine, Fidel Castro remarked at a meeting later in Luanda after liberation, where Konstantin Kurochkin, the head of the Soviet military mission, was present. He is more the academic type, continued Fidel. We are a little more, let's say, guerrillas. The Cubans poked fun at the Soviet posture in Angola, arguing that Russian war plans were drawn up for another era and another place. Castro ridiculed a scheme to retake a one-horse town held by the right-wing UNITA as a return of the Red Army's operation against Berlin. A few years later, he mocked the Soviet foreign minister, Anatoly Adameshin. What a bombastic distraction the Soviet effort to train a prestigious African army had been. You underestimated the bandits and concentrated on creating a big army with many tanks, guns, and artillery. Troops who knew how to parade. It was a great army for parades, he ended. Castro lived to see the Bolivarian moment in South America. Solidarity with the Venezuelans and Hugo Chavez, solidarity with Evo Morales in Bolivia, and it was interesting, and in living memory, that the minute they won the elections in Caracas and La Paz and Quito, the first thing these newly elected presidents of the Bolivarian republics did was to fly to Havana to consult with the old man who had made the first revolution in the South Americas. And he talked to them. And the advice he gave them all was, don't repeat some of the mistakes we did. Proceed cautiously, proceed carefully, for the enemy is powerful, but time is on our side. And in these discussions, he explained what it was like to be battling in the 21st century after all the changes that had been wrought by the 20th, both revolutionary changes and counter-revolutionary changes. History, of course, will be the final judge. Long before his death, earlier this week, Fidel Castro had already been elevated by a vast number of South Americans to the plinth occupied by the great liberators of the continent, Simón Bolívar, San Martín, Sucre, José Martí. We have lost a great revolutionary. Despite the setbacks, he was always sure that others would come after him. He was deeply shocked by the sudden death of Hugo Chavez, whom he regarded as one of his successors, as a continental leader who had a global impact, like Fidel did. Fidel Castro was the last in a list of revolutionary leaders who transformed the 20th century. In 1917, after the Russian Revolution, whose centenary we will be marking next year, Lenin, the leader of the Russian Revolution, proclaimed that one of the tragedies that often befall revolutions is when they become isolated. They had been hoping that backward Russia would be relieved by the triumph of the revolution in the rest of Europe. They were hoping and banking on the German Revolution because they felt it was going to be extremely difficult to construct socialism in a single country. And this has been a problem with most of the revolutions of the 20th century, that contrary to what was written in the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, revolutions have happened not in the most advanced countries of capital, but in the most backward, with large peasant majorities in most cases. The Russian Revolution was followed by huge upheavals in Asia. In 1949, the Chinese armies, the Red Armies, the Eighth Route Army of Mao Zedong and Chu Te and the other Chinese leaders marched into Beijing and declared Beijing to be a socialist republic. Now, socialism, of course, conceived of in its most elementary fashion as a social structure that was going to do away with landlordism and capitalism. That's all. That was the definition. As to how it would go beyond that was not possible within the confines of even large states like the Soviet Union and China. Might it be easier in smaller states? The Vietnamese struggle carried on from before the First World War to the Declaration of Independence in 1945, to the subsequent interventions by France, Britain, and finally the United States. And in these civil wars and battles, much was lost by the countries. We have to admit that the Vietnamese in particular were wrecked by the large-scale killings. Over 2 million Vietnamese people died. The use of chemical weapons, napalm in particular, but Agent Orange, which destroyed the ecology of the country and from which people are still suffering today. To build socialism as we conceive it in its most utopian sense in these conditions is not easy. What you get is an approximation. And it is on these approximations that the people had to live. And it has to be said that for an overwhelming majority of people in these countries, the revolution represented a huge step forward from what had existed before. So there's no question of any moral equivalence between the revolutionary and post-revolutionary governments and what had existed before. Cuba was the last of these revolutions. It came in the end of the 50s and the very beginning of the 60s. The mood had changed. I remember full well reading at the time of how Cuban print workers used to criticize the media in their country, which was misreporting the revolution, misreporting the strikes that were taking place in the cities, and effectively, the bulk of the media in Cuba backed the dictatorship in one shape or another, as did the Venezuelan media from the time of Chavez to now, as did the Bolivian media, as did the Ecuadorian media. 90% of the media owned by the big corporations or individual billionaires naturally reflected the views of their proprietors. The notion that this is freedom of the press is laughable, it's risible. And in Cuba, the print workers devised an incredible method of making their views heard. It's not that they would refuse to print what was being written, by the editors and sub-editors and the others in employ of the newspapers, but where it was blatantly false, what they would do was insert a tale. At the bottom of the article, they would say, the Print Workers' Union of newspaper X or Y or Z does not agree with this assessment in the editorial. We think A, B, C, D, E. And that had a huge impact because they didn't stop anything being published. They just put in another view using their position at the point of production. And for a time, the proprietors were unable to act against this because the mood in the country was revolutionary. And I always felt that the use of tales was a wonderful method to actually challenge the dominant ideology. Would that we could put these tales at the end of BBC programs, or people who work in the BBC could, and challenge the management and the bosses, or in any other programs today, leave alone the print media. A form of tales have developed, of course, on the internet, but that is A, not authoritative, and B, quite diverse. There's nothing concrete that emerges, except in a country like France with Mediapart, which challenges the priorities of the mainstream. But the tales introduced by the Cuban print workers were absolutely crucial. Now, what chance did revolutionary Cuba have of creating a model democratic system? This is a debate that carries on today. There was no chance at all. Invaded, attacked, dozens and dozens of attempts on the life of Fidel Castro himself, as the CIA has now admitted, agents infiltrated into Cuba and into the Cuban Communist Party to try and destabilize the regime. All this was taking place. Not exactly the best time to think of introducing a democracy which you know can be easily manipulated and funded by the United States, as it did all over South America. And here too, when democratic governments didn't follow the dictates of Washington, as in Chile in 1973, they got rid of the government. As we know, we now have all the details how Kissinger organized the coup in Chile and handed the country over to Pinochet, fully backed by the United States, backed by most of the NATO countries. Of course, they had a few things to say, maybe he's gone too far, we don't support everything, but effectively, Pinochet's Chile was given a great deal of support by these countries. So I don't take the arguments from liberals or conservatives about Cuban democracy too seriously. We know very much the democracy they practice at this day. I would therefore, in the spirit of the revolution, especially the revolution in its opening years, like to conclude by quoting something written by one of the great Latin American writers, Eduardo Galeano, a few years before he died, which has been published posthumously. He saw Fidel as the Don Quixote of South America, and he left behind this memorial or homage or obituary, which is interesting because it expresses what many, many people feel who were uneasy about some of the things that happened. These are the words of Eduardo Galeano, with which I have a great deal of sympathy. His enemies say he was an uncrowned king who confused unity with unanimity, and in that, his enemies are right. His enemies say that if Napoleon had a newspaper like Granma, no Frenchman would have learned of the disaster at Waterloo. And in that, his enemies are right. His enemies say that he exercised power by talking a lot and listening little, because he was more used to hearing echoes than voices. And in that, his enemies are right. But some things his enemies do not say. It was not to pose for the history books that he bared his breast to the invaders' bullets. He faced hurricanes as an equal, hurricane to hurricane. He survived 637 attempts on his life. His contagious energy was decisive in making a country out of a colony. And it was not by Lucifer's curse of God's miracle that the new country managed to outlive 10 American presidents, their napkins spread in their laps, ready to eat the island with knife and fork. And his enemies never mention that Cuba is one rare country that does not compete for the World Doormat Cup. And they do not say that the revolution, punished for the crime of dignity, is what it managed to be and not what it wished to become. Nor do they say that the wall separating desire from reality grew ever higher and wider, thanks to the imperial blockade, which suffocated a Cuban-style democracy, militarized society, and gave the bureaucracy, always ready with a problem for every solution, the alibis it needed to justify and perpetuate itself. And they do not say that in spite of all the sorrow, in spite of the external aggression and the internal high-handedness, this distressed and obstinate island has spawned the least unjust society in Latin America. And his enemies do not say that this feat was the outcome of the sacrifice of its people, and also of the stubborn will and old-fashioned sense of honor of the knight who always fought on their side. Farewell, Fidel.
Desaparezca la filosofía del despojo y habrá desaparecido la filosofía de la guerra. Desaparezcan las colonias. Desaparezca la explotación de los países por los monopolios. Y entonces la humanidad habrá alcanzado una verdadera etapa de progreso.
Se acabó la diversión, llegó el comandante.
Ocurre inevitablemente que en las naciones donde es más fuerte el control de los monopolios yanquis, más despiadada la explotación de la oligarquía y más insoportable la situación de las masas obreras y campesinas, el poder político se muestra más férreo.
Sin sospechar que en la sierra
La revolución es sentido del momento histórico. Es cambiar todo lo que debe ser cambiado. Es igualdad y libertad plena. Es ser tratado y tratar a los demás como seres humanos. Es emanciparnos por nosotros mismos y con nuestros propios esfuerzos. Es desafiar poderosas fuerzas dominantes dentro y fuera del ámbito social y nacional. Es defender valores en los que se cree, al precio de cualquier sacrificio. Es modestia, desinterés, altruismo, solidaridad y heroísmo. Es no mentir jamás ni violar principios éticos. Es convicción profunda de que no existe fuerza en el mundo capaz de aplastar la fuerza de la verdad y las ideas. Revolución es unidad, es independencia, es luchar por nuestro sueño de justicia para Cuba y para el mundo, que es la base de nuestro patriotismo, nuestro socialismo y nuestro internacionalismo.
Llegó el comandante y mandó a parar.